Thank you for listening to the Rant Supply podcast. My name is Paul. I decided to do this podcast for various reasons, but number one, because depression is something that I'm really familiar with. It's been a lifelong companion of mine, traveling companion. It's not something that I'm terribly open to talking about. I think it's something that most people aren't really open to talking about. It's a really difficult thing to explain, and that's why a lot of the times if you deal with someone who is depressed clinically, who has a chemical imbalance as we understand it right now, it's hard to get that person to open up, and there's a lot of reasons for that, and I'm not an authority on this by any stretch of the mind. I'm not a doctor. I'm just a guy who has been dealing with it on and off for a very long time, and I've known a lot of people who've dealt with it, and I've known more people than I like who have succumbed to the finality of suicide, and I think that's a really terrible thing. That oftentimes it's not that these people have not looked for help. They just haven't found it. So there's a few things I'll try to explain a little bit about how the depressed mind works, or at least my interpretation of it. And this isn't just me. This is having talked to numerous people who've been depressed. But first things first, when you try to approach the subject of depression and you ask someone, what's wrong? What happened? Well, did this happen? Did that? That's actually the hardest conversation for someone who is clinically depressed, because it's not about that. It's not about the world. There is no explanation. There is no excuse. There is no justification. In fact, knowing that is that much worse, because it adds a level of guilt. It adds a serious level of shame. You feel like you're being a baby, like you're overreacting, and most importantly, you feel oddly selfish, because self-loathing and self-hatred, while they're not what would typically be understood as selfish or self-centered, they are. And speaking as someone who's dealt with this, I can admit that they are, and it took me a long time to get there. And it's not voluntary. That's one thing that people don't understand. Well, just snap out of it. We'll just deal with it. We'll just get over it. It's just not that simple. I wish it were. I have no proof besides the psychological documents that attempt to prove that it's a chemical imbalance, but it's not really any proof there either. I hope that it is, because it's at least an explanation. And if it is, then it's akin to someone who has type 1 diabetes, whose body simply does not produce insulin at the levels that it's supposed to. And so if there are certain chemicals, serotonin, dopamine, epinephrine, there's a lot of chemicals that the body deals with, and in someone who's clinically depressed, they are not being produced either in high enough quantities, or probably more appropriately, in the right combination of levels that they should be. And this, I think, oftentimes it's like a muscle atrophying at some point when you're a kid. And this, I'm not claiming that I came up with any of this. This is from having been lucky enough to talk to and watch different people who are a lot smarter than me and have a lot more medical background and a greater medical understanding of this than I do. And like I said, I hope that they're right, because at least it gives an explanation. But like I said, I think it's much like a muscle atrophy in the fact that at some point in life, I would expect in childhood, something happens where you become persistently unhappy in some way, persistently depressed. And it stunts the growth or the production of these hormones, these chemicals in the proper levels. And therefore, it never develops properly to provide that throughout life. Or it's very difficult for it to develop to that point. And I think that's the best explanation I've ever heard. And I hope that it's right, because it makes sense to me. But this is what I can say on a non-medical and more personal level about it, is that when someone shuts down and you try to ask them, oh, what's wrong? Well, what happened? It's not that that person doesn't want to tell you because they don't trust you or because of whatever. It's that that's the worst question they can think of at the time, because they know that they don't have an answer for you. They know that they should be happy for their blessings in life. They know that there are people much worse off. You know, the man with no shoes was sad because he had no shoes, and then he saw a man with no feet. To an average person, that's an eye-opener. It is to someone who's depressed too, but what it opens their eyes to is, it further opens their eyes to their own selfishness, their own failings, their own self-centered and, I guess, lack of ability to cope with something that they know full well they should be able to cope with. And that leads to guilt, shame, and it becomes a cycle. And so not being able to answer the question is not a personal thing. And so if you've ever felt hurt that you are trying to help and you are trying to reach out, I don't know that this is the case in every situation, and I'm sure that it's not, but I know for a fact that it's been the case many times for me. It's been the case many times for friends, for family, that person knows that in their mind, they're not worth your help. Because if they had a justification for how they felt, they would deal with it. They could deal with it. But when you have someone who is depressed, clinically depressed, and they are not able to open up, it's because they know you can't understand, because how could you possibly understand something that they don't? And like I said, there is no justification for. And even opening up and telling you that is shameful. So for moms and dads, especially, for husbands, wives, friends, if you know someone like this, one thing that person is probably afraid of is that if they open up to you and they tell you this, that they're going to hear that they're going to hear the words, you need help, you need to seek help, because it's a reinforcement of what they already know, that they themselves are fucked up, that there's something really wrong with them. And they just want to be normal. They don't want to feel like this anymore. They don't want to hate themselves. But there's something oddly comforting in depression. There's something oddly familiar about depression, and it's a really easy thing to fall back into, because it's home, because it's what you know. And I won't say that there's no warmth in it, there's no happiness in it, but when it's all you know, It's easier to navigate. That being said, someone who's dealt with this for 25 years, to those who are depressed, this has been said over and over again, and I'm sure that anybody who's been depressed has heard these words, especially if you are contemplating suicide, that you are looking at a permanent solution to a temporary problem. Now, I understand how ridiculous that sounds to somebody who's dealt with this all of their life, because it isn't a temporary problem. This is a persistent problem, and it gets exhausting. It becomes so tiring dealing with it day in and day out, because it's self-loathing. People have this misunderstanding that someone who is depressed doesn't care about anything. Nothing could be further from the truth. It's not that person doesn't care about anything. It's their inability to affect things in the way that they feel they should be able to, that they'd like to. Their inability to help those that they love, or be there for those that they love in the way that they feel that they should. That is crippling. Because sometimes all you can do, and all you should do if you're depressed, is sit still and quiet, and you wait for the fucking ride to end. And I don't mean by the ride, I don't mean life. I mean the terrible bouts with depression are temporary. And when you're depressed, you don't believe that. You don't believe that it's going to get any better. But objectively, it does. Because depression comes like tide. There are ebbs and flows. There's high tide, there's low tide. And for a lot of people who are depressed, no, it does not stop. I understand that. I've been there. But, I wanted to say this too, that for somebody who doesn't understand depression, there is a feeling by someone who is depressed, this knowledge that they are selfish in a way that they can't possibly explain, self-centered in a way that they can't possibly explain. And admitting that is terrible, but trying to tell someone that they feel selfish for even feeling this way is even worse, because there is, again, no justification for why. It's just that it doesn't stop. It's that your mind keeps telling you what a massive runny bucket of shit that you are as a human being. I do have a few tips. One, the most important thing that you can do if you're depressed is call yourself on your shit. At least once a day, but more important, if possible, as often as you can. Every time you tell yourself that you're worthless, that you have no value, that you'd be better off dead, that everyone around you would be better off dead, the best thing you can do is get pissed off at that voice and call them a liar and tell them they're full of shit. Because it's true. Because I've never met a person who's been right about that. The second thing, don't ever go to bed having done nothing. Because once you understand that as a human being, all you've got, the best that you've got, is the ability to try and give it everything within you. If you do that every day, even a little bit, you give it something, you force yourself into 5 minutes of real effort to move forward. You look in the mirror and you say, you know what? Eat shit. I'm not just going to give up. I'm not just going to lay down. And it's something that has to be done all the time, because every day that you go and you allow it to grow, it gets worse. So you have to put some barrier to it growing. There is love for everyone. You got to learn to love yourself. But before you can love yourself, you got to learn to stop hating yourself. So you got to be honest. I hope I helped. God bless you all.